All right, thanks to everyone for joining us at the WAN Summit today. I'm Jason Ginnert with WAN Dynamics, and I'll be the moderator of our next panel, Unlocking Next-Gen Security, Protecting the Ever-Changing Network, where we'll be exploring security in a WAN context. Our discussion will highlight some of the things our esteemed panelists recommend considering as the network evolves. As with the other sessions, we'll be using the Crowd Compass app for you to ask questions. So in the app, scroll down to the live Q&A section to submit questions as we go, and we'll address them towards the end of the session. Be sure to mention who you are and who you're with so we can better understand the perspective of your question. So with that, let's all make some brief introductions of our panelists. Kieran, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Jason, and hi, everybody. So my name is Kieran Roach, and I'm co-founder and CTO of CoEvolve. We provide managed SD-WAN services in a telco-independent way, and also moving quite rapidly into the security space and multi-cloud as well. So this is a really interesting topic for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. Carl, tell us more about yourself.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Carl Smith. I work for Tata Communications and I run a network and security specialist sales practice. So nice to be here.
Thanks, Carl. Marcus.
Yeah, I'm Marcus Hacker. I'm CTO and co-founder of Engena. Engena provides a connectivity platform as a service, which is built on SD-WAN technology, and also includes a broad set of security services. And we have fully automated configuration and deployment processes for enterprise networks on global scale.
Excellent, thank you, Marcus. And Nick.
Hello, everybody. I'm Nick Higgins. I'm the head of product of Asavi. Asavi is an enterprise mobile network security company. Most recently, we just got acquired by Akamai on October 27th. So I'm probably being a little bit confused at the moment, but now very happy to be part of Akamai.
Excellent. Well, thanks to all of you for joining us today. I think it's going to be a lively discussion about security and the impact to the WAN. So let's jump right in. The WAN has changed quite a bit, with the addition of SD-WAN, and there's been a lot of considerations to be made around network security. So, the first question would be, how has SD-WAN changed the way enterprises should approach network security? And Carl, let's start with you on your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my first point is interesting that we talk about how has SD-WAN changed how we look at network security. And for me, SD-WAN is just a way to deliver services in a hybrid environment and now moved into an internet environment. So it's actually the question for me should be, how has the internet as being a kind of enterprise deliverable, how has that changed how we should consider security? And it's fundamentally is that we have all of our users now accessing corporate resources and applications that no longer pass through a common data center or within a particular firewall perimeter. So that's the consideration that I think we need to do. So we need to look at how we're adopting, and we're talking about SASE later on, but we need far more robust security edge devices, which really begs the question, where is the edge? SD-WAN is a technology that is very much as a branch technology. But of course, now that you've got users that are accessing from home, and we don't have, we talked earlier on today about teleography saying that there's 10% or less than 10% of enterprises deploying a branch device in a remote user's home. And therefore, the edge is actually the host or indeed the application. And I think that's the real consideration now, is how to protect that data when it's not going through that branch environment. And we need to move away fundamentally from the concept of cloud and moat, castle and moat. We no longer just have an edge to protect. We have to protect everything, and we have to assume that anybody within or outside your organization could be a bad actor.
It's a great point. The edge has become everywhere when it pertains to security. So, Mick, the products you represent really live quite a bit in that space. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Asabi is not, we're not an SD-WAN vendor, but what we do is we bring mobile inside the enterprise network. We kind of coined a phrase called branch of one. So with, especially, post-COVID, and people are working from home, but they're also working from shared spaces. They're working in many different locations. So why not get the same security as you would have in your branch wherever you are? And you don't need a CPE, or you don't need a client. You can actually do it with your mobile phone, a mobile line, and with the network security integrations that Asabi provides, you can be a branch of one and have the same security posture as if you're in the branch. So, and that's the kind of way we're approaching it, the kind of the future of work in the secure office anyway.
Excellent. Marcus, what's your perspective on how SD-WAN has changed the approach to network security?
Yeah. So for me, SD-WAN and also the new security concepts are more an answer of the changed customer requirements, because customers do not just operate anymore their applications in some central data center, and they need not just to protect a few of their customer locations, offices, or production sites. And it was already mentioned, the castle moat philosophy, just to protect your own environment is not good anymore, not anymore good enough. So nowadays, applications are running on multiple cloud platforms. People, as was mentioned, are working from home, from remote locations if they're on the move, and so on. So you have two key requirements which you need to consider. First, you need to still ensure a proper network quality, meaning transport quality. And this is what SD-WAN is solving, because it allows you to ensure a proper connectivity and quality of connectivity across multiple underlays, multiple locations. But of course, there are a lot of additional requirements with regards to security, because you can't anymore purely rely on the former concept of perimeter security, which you run on your own sites. Because if people are moving around, if you have a lot of applications on the cloud platforms, you need also to make the security concept persuasive. So that means that you protect all the different access points of your IT architecture. And therefore, there's a consequence to it. So connectivity and security can't anymore be separate items. They need to be considered in a joint approach. And that is finally what all the new concept, especially being brought together in the SASE concept, is all about. Having SD-WAN as a service to optimize transport and connectivity, and to have the accordingly proper security concept with security as a service being brought together in a homogeneous, consistent concept. That's my view.
Yeah, I would have to agree. During our travels at WAN Dynamics and talking to customers about SD-WAN, security is often a key part of the conversation, and sometimes omitted initially from the planning phases. So we've definitely found that it's true that you really have to have a holistic approach when it comes to the WAN and security. And Kieran, you've probably had similar conversations.
We have, definitely. And what we've seen is, if we look back at the early days of SD-WAN, things were still very siloed then. So it was an SD-WAN conversation replacing the network component. And then you had a separate security conversation with different buying cycles, different procurement models, and the two barely communicated with each other at all. But we've seen a real convergence of those two silos really over the last couple of years in particular, and I think the drivers are a lot of the things we've heard today. People want to be able to segment all the way down to an individual user or device level. You can't get down into that level of granularity if you're treating security as being completely separate to SD-WAN. So I think SD-WAN may have been an enabler in terms of driving a new way of managing these endpoints and managing the networks, but it's also opened the door to a more unified approach where you're considering security from the very beginning, which in all honesty, it's probably how it should have been from the beginning anyway. So I think it's moving towards a much more comprehensive model for these enterprises where the security component is pretty deeply ingrained in that network, which is becoming essential as the applications and the destinations move outside of that perimeter into the public cloud. So it's definitely starting to mature as an overall model, is what we would see across our clients.
And Kieran, staying with you, what would you say are some of the key decisions that clients have to make, and maybe further some of the obstacles that you encounter when you're considering security in an SD-WAN context?
I think one of the interesting things we see a lot of enterprises wrestle with is this concept of a sunk cost or investment in appliances, that as the applications and the destinations start to move to different locations, as the users and the user geographic profile changes completely, like we've seen this year, how can you maintain that investment in the current state where it's become much more dynamic? So I think we're starting to see enterprises really look towards subscription models for how they buy both network and security services, because it allows them to maybe have more flexing up or flexing down or moving spend between different components, as opposed to buying an asset and having to require that asset be used for 5 years, whatever the number is going to be. So definitely a transition more towards services to be able to accommodate that change in usage patterns. The other thing that we're seeing is we're seeing a huge increase in the whole concept of what services sit at the edge or at the branch and what services sit within the cloud, and how do you how much of that can be provided by a single vendor, how much of it is really best served by specialist providers, how do you integrate all of that together? So we're starting to see enterprises really trying to weigh up the different options there and try to find out what mix of that is going to work best for them. But it's a pretty rapidly changing environment for the enterprise to try to navigate, because the vendors and the offerings that were relevant even 2 to 3 years ago have completely changed in many ways since then. And I think there's a real need there for some clarity and guidance to help transition through that process.
And that transition has accelerated at an even greater pace this year, obviously, with so many folks working from home now and trying to accommodate that remote workforce. It's definitely changed a lot of the conversations I know we're having. Carl, your perspective on that, what security decisions are key for the clients that you encounter for SD-WAN adoption?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, to Kieran's point, it's actually who's buying now. Whereas I think previously it was rather gone down a utility route. It was the infrastructure people that would just be looking at dare I say, the best bang for the buck on the underlay service. And actually the overlay was, yes, it delivered, but it didn't really get into their value stack. It didn't really get in. So now we're more looking at the more application developers, the CISOs, and that's the consideration they're looking at now, is to say, when we talk user experience, and actually that just converts to productivity. So how do I get my users on the network accessing the data that they need to use to be, give an efficient product at the end of the day for that business, but do it in a completely trusted environment, and again without the ability to have lateral movement within the organization to access data that they shouldn't necessarily be accessing. So that's the consideration I'm seeing.
Okay, excellent. So Marcus, kind of moving on to dive deeper into some of those security vendors, SD-WAN vendor, and the partnerships between them. So what should enterprises expect in terms of partnerships between security vendors and SD-WAN vendors, and kind of the disparate solutions that are out there?
Yeah. So I think what you see and have seen over a few years is that really all of the vendors have tried to expand their portfolio. The security portfolio vendors, also the security vendors, very much into the SD-WAN space and vice versa. Just to give you a few examples. So I think we all know that Cisco has heavily invested. I think I would argue even in both areas with the tail acquisition on SD-WAN and with security. Just to mention a few of their, a lot of acquisitions is portfolio shift to dual open DNS, and you could continue. You have seen also players like Fortinet, very strong on the security in the past, having done a lot of developments themselves on SD-WAN, but recently also even strengthened their portfolio on the SD-WAN side with the Opac Networks acquisition. Just to give a third example, it is Palo Alto, having was strong on firewall and security, having acquired CloudGenix. So I think all that move shows that the providers, the technology providers, try to follow what we just discussed in the previous section, to have this comprehensive approach, because also they fully understand that they need to bring security and networking capabilities in a consistent manner and not just in silos, right? So I think nearly all of them follow that approach. And then it's up to, of course, telcos, system integrators, or companies like Engena ourselves, to more or less simplify it, to offer it as a service, because the complexity in itself doesn't go away. So it needs a lot of further standardization, thinking, proper implementation, partially on cloud-based platforms, easy to consume, to make it, I would say, simple to use it, meaning to configure and deploy that services. And I think that is then where a lot of other players beyond the pure technology providers come into that game, right? So I think the industry, from an overall perspective, has adapted that concept already quite nicely, as well from the technology, as well as from the, I would say, delivery point of view. But still be in an early stage, right? And we should not underestimate the complexity which comes with it.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I think early in the SD-WAN arc, you saw a lot of modularity integration options between security and SD-WAN solutions. Whereas now you're seeing them to kind of bleed together with SASE. You're seeing a pretty comprehensive. Each one of these vendors has a comprehensive security and WAN stack. So in the SASE realm. That's definitely, with Gartner coining the term, and now there being a lot of emphasis on that as a technology stack. Mick, I'm wondering your perspective on how that's going to evolve, and what enterprises really need to be thinking about in a SASE context.
Yeah, I would say, just my perspective is, today I think the network team and are kind of a little bit siloed. Yes, they're getting more into security, but the reality is they need to think more like, what are their users or their employees? And they sit across laptops, they sit across phones, they sit across devices. And so there's missing this concept, I would say, of identity. And a user has an identity, but that user can have multiple devices and access them from multiple places. So I definitely think that identity is going to play a big role, and we're going to have to deal with the fact that employees, users, or even things need to access the business resources in the private DC, private cloud, public SaaS, or internet from many different locations, and you want a unified enterprise service. Let me give you an example. You can have the best next-gen firewall in the world, and your corporate Wi-Fi is set up to block whatever you want. Everybody just takes their phone and turn on their hotspot, and they bypass all the security that they have in their service. This is happening all over the place. So you're paying for a mobile phone for your employee with a mobile line, and they're using it to bypass all your security because they're in a separate system, not following those same security procedures. So I would again say that, and I think this is what SASE is about. SASE is about, it's really about focusing on the identity of the user, and that user can have multiple devices connecting from multiple different places. And I think that's that's one of the things that Savvy is a big fan of SASE, because we think it's the right approach.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more that the identity is a really big part of the security evolution. And when you start talking about, zero trust network access models and how to tie all of that in with whether it's SD-WAN or remote users connecting in via VPN, there's a lot of considerations to be made there. So Carl, the conversations you're having with customers around SASE, how do you feel the market's evolving, and how are you, finding solutions for clients, for enterprises in that realm?
I think the first question we tend to ask is, we talk about zero trust, but at what point is zero trust? Are we trusting the LAN, which then uses some form of VPN connection into an SDP environment, or are we suggesting that it's zero trust host? But there's a danger, I guess, that zero trust has become a marketing term that companies are trying to get to without actually delivering real zero trust. And for me, the conversations that we have, and particularly with NetFoundry, is that zero trust is really only at the application. It can only be, as we talk about identity verification, microsegmentation of that particular application, that can only access at that point using this particular algorithm, because it's looking at how is the user accessing the data at what time, and actually having this kind of endpoint detection, looking at making sure that the user is doing what they should be doing at the right time. For instance, we talk about Edward Snowden and being an NSA operative. Of course, if he had zero trust, or the NSA had zero trust within that, he wouldn't do that lateral movement, because it would immediately flag it to some kind of SOAR and SIEMs architecture that would then immediately block that access, because it has to have continuous posture analysis, and it needs to make sure that they're continuing to to be legitimate traffic. So they're the conversations that we're having. I think what we're typically finding at the moment is the reluctance to adopt is based upon the perceived complexity. When we're looking, I mentioned NetFoundry, and we're looking at a real kind of zero trust application access. This is a service that is purely software. It can embed itself in an application via SDK. It can be spun up in absolutely minutes. And the fact that it's modular as well, is you can look at your use case of your business and say, well, actually, this is my priority, and I can make this micro-segmented application here and solve that particular use case, whilst then rolling out a particular service as the business tends to evolve. So that tends to be the conversations that we're having now.
How about you, Kieran? What are your thoughts on zero trust?
I think it's an interesting term that is a bit like SASE is sort of being used and molded into whatever exact definition the vendors and service providers in some cases want to make around it. So I think there's still some ambiguity around what it really means. I think certainly, though, I agree with a lot of what Carl said there, that it's very much around tying individual identities back to what they can access and continually assessing that posture to make sure that it's within the policies that have been defined. So we're working with some clients today, for example, on what you could call zero trust solutions, where it's very much focused around users that sit outside of a branch office, and you can limit it very specifically to say these identities, and you can control the verification of that identity through various factors and so on. And here are the applications that they can access. And maybe even though the access is limited to certain times of the day or from certain device types that they can connect to and so on. So there's a lot of policies that can be implemented there, but the general concept is that you move the perimeter of the network all the way in, so that you're really treating the perimeter as being where the applications reside, and then anything outside of that, the default position is that it's untrusted. But the reality is it starts to get quite complicated when you think about all the things that are in a branch office that aren't easily brought into that model, like dealing with printers, dealing with management of all of the other endpoints that sit in that device, switches and access points, dealing with all of the legacy devices that can't necessarily provide an identity into this environment. And no enterprise is sort of a very clean greenfield environment where all of this works well. They all have complexity and baggage and legacy systems that people are afraid to touch or to turn off or reboot because they haven't been touched in so long. That's the biggest challenge, I think, to really going down this path, that it's not necessarily a very clean environment where you can say, here's my perimeter at the center and everything else is going to be untrusted outside of that. Everything becomes an exception then, and it's a really difficult environment for the enterprises to manage. But I can see the vision as to why many enterprises want to get there, but I think it's going to be a long journey for them to actually put that into practice.
Agree. It's kind of, you know, putting the different devices and users into buckets where you can determine, you know, what role should these users have and what ultimately what network access should they be allowed to have. It's like you said, very messy in many organizations to put those devices into buckets, and there's always outliers that you have to account for. And you know, and this kind of leads into, you mentioned, you know, remote work and remote users being a very hot topic, which we found as well. And, you know, things like, you know, you have a trusted device and that has one set of access policy versus, you know, bring your own and untrusted devices, and that having a different set of connotations as far as network access. So Marcus, you know, in your travels, what have you seen as far as accommodating remote work and in a SASE model?
Yeah, you know, if I just reflect a little bit on the pure concepts, right? The basic concept seems to be, and I only can emphasize what the others have said, seems to be very simple, right? You have users, you have devices, and then you have any kind of resources, applications, and they just need to identify against each other anytime they have interactions, right? In reality, it is really, really horribly complex, as already was explained. Just think about hundreds or thousands of interacting with hundreds or even up to thousands of applications, and somebody needs to maintain define all that role, access rights, and so on. And if you then think about additional concepts like least privileged access, or what also already was mentioned, microsegmentation, to really confine it to a specific set of applications which has to be accessed or can be accessed, I think it is very obvious that it's extremely complex to introduce this kind of concept. I would also like to add that currently in many organizations, you still have different responsibilities. You have still very much the people are responsible for networking. Networking is also very much, and then SD-WAN comes again into the overall game, because it's also about best path routing. It's not just to secure anything or everything, sorry, but it's also to have good access. So to have application optimization, so having application aware network and finding the best path to reach to your application needs to be considered at the same time. So you have the networking guys having to think about this piece. Then you have the security guys who have the specific requirement about the zero trust concept. Then I also need to structure their IT environment and landscape accordingly, because microsegmentation only means very carefully thinking about restructuring of your IT environment and landscape. So all the three camps definitely have to work together. Now, that is one aspect. The other one is all of that still needs to be manageable. So you typically can manage it if you have a central control to ensure somewhat consistency even across a quite complex infrastructure or environment. Now, you already have two domains. One is the networking, the other one is security, which somehow needs to come together in the policies to be consistent. That is one piece of, I would say, complexity. Another one, and now I want to elaborate a little bit on the edge topic. Of course, to maintain this kind of policies, not at each and every device and each and every customer location, but more at the cloud edge, simply to reduce the number of environments you need to update and you need to maintain. On the other hand, if you only have too few of these cloud edges, then from a networking perspective, you would see a lot of kind of tromboning, and you may sacrifice the quality of the transport itself because your routing gets somehow a little bit awkward, and you see a lot of or lengthy high delay times and things like that. So I think if you really think about implementation, it's a lot about really understanding this topic and finding the right, I would say, trade-offs where you do topics on site but still have some central configuration and control. What are the pieces of your concept which you can already, I think, move more to the cloud environment? And to conclude, I think there is not a solution like one size fits all. It really requires a careful thinking per customer network, per customer, I would say, specific requirements, and especially also thinking about the transformation, because we should not forget, you can't jump simply there. It sometimes requires several transformational steps to really innovate or modernize your infrastructure.
I think we all agree that not one size fits all, and it's a process. It's you have to iterate through a few changes to get to the end state. Just wanted to remind everyone to feel free to ask your questions in the Crowd Compass app, and we'll address those here towards the end. And kind of switching gears, really. Access is changing too for when it comes to SD-WAN. So not only are we talking about wireline options, but we're talking about mobility, we're talking about 5G. I wanted to kind of talk about, in a security context, as it pertains to some of those. Does that change the conversation with your customers? And how has mobility and 5G impacted some of the WAN security considerations? And Mick, I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, I mean, probably if you saw the notice, one of the main reasons I think Akamai bought Savvy was to bring in the 5G element into their portfolio, because we essentially today create private network slices for an enterprise. And that's what we do. We do it on demand. And we essentially, I would say, we make the mobile estate look like a LAN, that they can control everything from the IP address. They can ensure the policy. They can ensure that if they have a next-gen firewall, that they can bring that in. So that's absolutely a play. Now, the challenge for a small company like Asabi was 5G really means latency. It means like 30 milliseconds, less than 10 milliseconds. So in a country like the US, it means rather than a few pops, it means pops in every single major metro and even tier 2 cities to hit those kind of latencies for 95% of the population. So, and that's going to drive players who can really distribute the edge and provide that. And then I think that that's absolutely you're going to see changes where you have 5G only access with a private network slice and integrated into whatever SASE or zero trust solution you have. So it's going to change these network architectures, absolutely. 1 gig, 30 milliseconds. I think it's those kind of performances. They're really going to give fixed networking run for their money, especially for smaller branches and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yes, very, very much so. Does anybody else have any thoughts on 5G mobility and how that's going to affect security in the WAN?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing some potential there. As Mick said, there's a great possibility there to just remove some of the challenges around wireline connectivity. And for a lot of our clients, that's one of the big obstacles, is just getting good quality wired connectivity and diverse connectivity as well. So being able to provide a completely diverse medium for the connectivity with usable levels of bandwidth and latency and other metrics as well is a pretty attractive proposition to enterprises. I think as it relates to security, we're seeing some clients look at the type of private wireless connectivity that Mick has mentioned there, we do see clients using that as an alternative to putting in a VPN layer within their network, for example, so that they're connecting in through an APN that only gives them access to the corporate resources that the device needs to get access to. So if there's just far lower risk from a security perspective, and it can improve performance as well if you don't have to add an additional layer of encryption across the top. So we're seeing a lot of that happen already. I think the challenge there is making that be widely available to all device types again. So how do you handle that in a BYOD environment? It's very easy to do for corporate owned devices or industrial devices like sensors and so on, but it's difficult to expand that model out beyond that. So I think what we've concluded from that is that the underlay is still going to remain very fragmented for most enterprises, that there'll be components of it that work really well on some of these private solutions. And I think there's a huge promise for 5G in that space, but you're still going to have all of the other components in the underlay as well, dealing with all the ISPs and other telcos in that environment, and needing to pull that together into a cohesive solution is the difficult part of that, and to do it securely, obviously, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Very true. I think we'd like to segue into a few questions that are coming in from the audience. The first being, how new is the technology that falls under Zero Trust? It seems like some of it is a continuation of software-defined perimeter and other tech that has been around for a while, or is it more of a change in mindset, in the industry? Marcus, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter one. It is really more a mindset topic to really, in a very consistent and comprehensive manner, because I think the industry has worked with identities and validating identities since, I don't know, decades, I would argue, right? So this concept to have certificates and to have identities is absolutely true. It's nothing conceptually new, but to really say that any kind of interaction needs to be validated before I execute. And it's not just the doorkeeper topic, right? I always like to use that example like a party, right? You want to enter a party, you have some gatekeeper asking you if you're in, you can eat, drink, and communicate to everybody, right? Now, if you translate that with Zero Trust, it would mean you need for every drink and for every interaction, every talk you want to have, you need to show your identity before you're allowed to do that, right? That is the example. So showing this passport or the identity is not the new thing, but to implement it, that you need to do it before you do any kind of interaction. That is Zero Trust, because the concept is needed because you don't have anymore a single door where you enter your party, but you may have hundreds of doors and even doors which you don't know, so that you can't put gatekeepers in front of it. So you need to protect the interaction itself, right? So that is, I think, what is a big change and what Zero Trust really is bringing with it.
That's a great analogy. Not just allowing blanket access, but every transaction questioning, the identity of that endpoint and the services they're trying to access, making sure they're authorized for each one of those. And I think that's very accurate. Carl, yeah, your thoughts on that? Is it new or is it built something?
I tend to agree with Marcus. I mean, I've in the past worked on government networks, and the amount of security and encryption that's needed and identity management has always been there. So this is now just a conceptual position driven by the fact that users are no longer in our castle, as we talked about. And ultimately, the concept of Zero Trust is that, I'm just delving into the last question about the 5G. It's just another access medium. It's just another means to get your data. And ultimately, a true Zero Trust shouldn't use IP. It should be IP obfuscated. And the transmission path should be completely dark. It should never be traced, never be tracked. It should be a dynamic core with ephemeral fabric that's constantly moving and changing, so there is no attack vector. So, but yeah, to your point though, Jason, no, it's just an amalgamation of a lot of practices we've used in the past.
Just like SD-WAN, SD-WAN, really the underlying technologies are an amalgamation of things we've had for a while that just came together in the right way.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. We have another question from the audience. What's the roadmap for next-gen firewall features being built into SD-WAN products as addressing security and SD-WAN at the same time become more and more critical? So, Kieran, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's been interesting to see in the last couple of years the next gen firewall vendors become SD-WAN vendors and vice versa. So there's already a lot of consolidation happening there, and I think the most likely path of progression there is that the successful players in those spaces are going to be the ones that have very strong security and networking credentials. So I think there's going to be a need for these vendors to play multiple roles. So there's the need for a certain level of functionality on the edge around identity verification and providing the ability for certain applications to take like a fast track to the cloud infrastructure. So say Microsoft traffic or Google traffic, where they do a lot of the threat protection in their own network. You just want to break it off as quickly as possible. But then for other traffic to do a deeper level of inspection and control on the device itself. And then there needs to be cloud scale services as part of this as well, so that the traffic that is being taken into the network can be inspected at scale. You can do advanced threat protection and so on at a sort of a POP level instead of all the way out at the very edge. So I think the functionality is going to need to mature across each of those areas. So both at the edge and at the cloud, but kind of under a centralized orchestration umbrella. And it really is going to be the vendors that have demonstrated the strong credentials from a security and networking perspective that will likely do well in that space. And we're seeing the signs of that already. We're seeing traditional on-premise vendors in the security space start to move much more into cloud-based offerings and really embrace that sort of hybrid model, and very much in line with the SASE concepts we talked about earlier. So it is going that direction, and I think it's probably along that similar trend that we'll see things continue to go.
Does anyone else have any input on on that topic, on the roadmap and integrating security services with the WAN?
Yeah, I mean, I just generally, I mean, Gartner, the Magic Quadrant will attest to it. I think that the emergent vendors will effectively be, it will switch from being an SD-WAN provider with some, we know first gen had some basic firewall functionality. Next gen had obviously next generation firewall, but I think moving forward, it will be actually the security vendors, because it's a much deeper and broader portfolio of services and solutions that you can integrate, rather than just an SD-WAN that effectively does NFV and some virtualized router function. So I think that the SD-WAN players, sorry, the security players will be the ones that will become dominant. And I think the acquisitions that we've seen over the last 12 months have attested to that as well.
Yeah, I agree. They're kind of growing towards one another, right? The pure play SD-WAN providers are adding those security components and becoming, competing more with the firewall vendors, and the security and firewall vendors are going the other way. They're growing towards one another. So I think you're all right. I think that the takes are that those two will become one, and we'll see this, more comprehensive SASE solution from a number of different vendors. Of course, different flavors with different features and functionality, but I agree with that. And I think we have one more question that we'll be wrapping up soon. The impact of IoT in a WAN security context. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we do that. We've been doing that for a number of years. So essentially, we've been integrating. So most IoT today, they typically come off onto the internet, and maybe they have a secure connection to the cloud, but they're pretty much sitting on the internet. So we've been doing that for many years. We do it with banks, with lottery terminals, with even a lot of, for example, the frontline workers, or even the rollout of the vaccine stations that are happening now with COVID and all the privacy concerns. They're all branches of one, and we integrate them into the SD-WAN. And yeah, so we definitely see that. And this is what we do today. We bring all those items in as a private network into the SD-WAN, so they can take advantage of the firewall, the security, the policies. and do it all without any clients or CPE devices.
Okay, great. Well, guys, I think that we're at hitting the end of the time for our session today. I wanted to thank all of you for the great conversation. I mean, I think that I think we covered a lot of the timely topics as it pertains to security in the WAN, and more we evolve, I'm sure we'll have a lot more exciting things to talk about at the next session about how far SASE's come, from this time. So. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to everyone out there for joining for the WAN Summit today. Thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Bye-bye.